I didn't leave the city because I was lost. I left because my life looked full, but it didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. There wasn't a dramatic breakup, no betrayal, no collapse. Just a Thursday afternoon when I looked at my calendar and realized not a single thing on it was actually for me. This isn't a story about escape. It's a story about a door that stayed slightly open and what walked through when I stopped closing myself off. My name is Lena, and I'm 34. I work as a freelance brand designer, a title that sounds freer than it feels. Yes, technically, I can work from anywhere. But for the past year, I've barely left my fourth-floor apartment in Denver. There was no dramatic collapse in my life.
No scandal. No betrayal.
Just a slow unraveling. A marriage that faded, not exploded. One day we looked at each other and realized we were no longer the people we once promised to love. No fight.
No screaming.
Just silence that had grown so thick. We forgot what it was like to reach across it. Since the divorce, I've lived like someone who knows how to look okay. I make my bed. I drink my green juice. I do Pilates twice a week. I meet deadlines. I answer emails with polite enthusiasm. On the outside, everything seems intact, but sometimes all it takes is a single moment to realize how far you've drifted from yourself. For me, it was a Thursday afternoon. I opened my calendar to plan the week and noticed something that made my chest tighten, then hollow out completely. Not a single thing on the list was for me. Not one item sparked joy. Not one task made me feel like I was actually living. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't pour a glass of wine or scroll through inspirational quotes. I simply opened a map. My eyes stopped at a name I didn't recognize immediately. Snoridge, a forested valley, tucked in the Colorado mountains. Quiet, remote, no major tourist attractions. Exactly what I didn't know I needed. I booked a cabin, not a luxury one. Just wood and stone and a fireplace. I didn't pack makeup. I didn't plan a detox. And I definitely didn't promise myself I'd find healing.
No.
I just wanted a place far enough that no one would expect anything of me. A pause in the middle of a life that had been running on autopilot. I told myself it would only be for a few days, just long enough to catch my breath. But even as I zipped my duffel bag, I knew deep down this wasn't just a break. It was the beginning of something I couldn't name yet. Something quietly waiting on the other side of stillness. The cabin was exactly as promised. Simple, quiet, worn in all the right places. The floorboards creaked just enough to remind you that stillness has a sound. The fireplace worked, but needed a bit of coaxing. There was a dusty bookshelf filled with paperbacks that smelled of pine and thyme. The windows framed a view of tall trees standing like sentinels, silent, unmoved. I didn't come here to find myself. I didn't come here to write a new chapter or chase transformation. I came here to stop running. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to explain why. I noticed them on the second evening. For men, mid-30s to early 40s, maybe, gathered around a fire outside the cabin next to mine. They weren't loud. In fact, that's what struck me first. Their stillness. They sat in worn jackets and hiking boots, their voices low, their movements unhurried, as if the mountain air itself slowed their pulses. There was something grounded about them, not rugged in the movie sense, not posed or polished. They looked like men who had done hard things and didn't feel the need to talk about them anymore. One of them looked up, just for a second. His gaze met mine, casual, curious, not invasive. I nodded politely and turned away, but something about that moment lingered.
It wasn't the way he looked at me.
It was the way he didn't look away too quickly, like he wasn't startled by being seen. The next morning, I told myself it didn't matter. I drank my coffee slowly, wrote a few lines in a notebook I hadn't touched in months, watched the snow drift down in slow spirals. But by nightfall, when I stepped onto the porch with a warm mug of cocoa, I found myself glancing toward their fire again. They were there, all four of them. Same formation, same silence. But now I could feel it, the magnetic weight of presence. The kind you don't recognize until you've gone too long without it. One of them, the one who had met my gaze the night before, shifted slightly, as if he sensed something, or maybe as if he didn't need to. I took a sip of cocoa, held my robe a little closer at the collar, and stood for a few moments longer than I needed to, not to be noticed, not to invite, just to feel what it was like to exist in proximity to people who weren't asking anything of me. Then I went back inside. I didn't close the door fully behind me, not because I forgot, but because something in me, a part one hadn't listened to in years, whispered, if someone walks through that door tonight, I won't run. Back inside the cabin, the fire crackled like it was trying to speak. I sat with my knees pulled up, the mug still warm in my hands, and the door behind me resting in a quiet in-between, not quite closed, not quite inviting. The kind of door that said, I'm not locked, but I'm not open to just anyone. The air inside felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just expectant, as if the walls had taken a breath and were waiting to see what I'd do with it. I poured a second glass of wine. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something else I hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty, with no threat. The kind that comes right before something changes. And then I heard it, the slow, unmistakable sound of heavy boots on the porch. Deliberate,
Steady.
followed by stillness. No knock, no rush. Just the subtle creak of a presence. The door eased open with a whisper.
He didn't speak.
Didn't clear his throat or shift nervously. He simply stood in the threshold, framed by cold air and soft firelight, as if the space had been waiting for his shape to fill it. I didn't turn around. I tilted my head slightly, exposing the bare slope of my shoulder, the strap of my robe hanging like punctuation left open at the end of a sentence. His voice came low and rough, like it had traveled through smoke to reach me. Am I interrupting? I shook my head slowly, still facing the fire. Only if you came to talk about the weather. The door clicked shut behind him.
Soft.
Final. The air changed again, warmer now, denser, not with tension, but presence. I turned to face him. He was taller than I expected, not imposing, anchored. A quiet strength that didn't try to prove itself. A thermal shirt, rough hands, soft eyes. That was what disarmed me first. He didn't look at me like someone trying to conquer. He looked at me like someone who understood the cost of staying silent too long. Do you always leave your door open for strangers? He asked, not moving closer. I met his gaze without flinching. I didn't let you in, I replied, taking a sip of wine. I just didn't close it.
He smiled barely.
Not cocky, not suggestive, just enough to let me know. He heard me. He understood. My name's Theo, he said. I'm staying next door. The others are old friends. We come up here this time every year. I nodded. I didn't ask for more.
Didn't need to.
Sometimes, names are enough when the air already knows the rest. We stood there, him near the door, me near the fire, like two people who weren't performing for each other, just existing, in the same room, with the same question neither of us had spoken aloud. I placed my glass on the table. Theo's eyes followed the motion, then drifted back to me. I adjusted the sash of my robe, not to close it, but to say, "If you step forward, I won't step away." He didn't rush, didn't assume. He took one step closer, lifted his hand, not to touch my face, but to rest it gently on the side of my neck, where my pulse gave away everything I couldn't say out loud. "Aren't you cold?" he whispered. I smiled. Nowhere near cold enough. Theo didn't move further. He just stood there with his hand on my neck, not gripping, not claiming, but resting, like he wanted me to feel something without it needing to be spoken. A silent rhythm, a warmth I hadn't realized I missed until it showed up, steady and unafraid. There was no music, no lighting,
No cinematic crescendo.
just the sound of our breath beginning to sink. I didn't remember who leaned in first. Maybe it didn't matter, because when our lips met, it wasn't a collision. It was a meeting, soft, patient, and deeply sure. His hands never wandered. They stayed low on my waist, firm enough to remind me I was being held, but never as if I were something to be taken. We kissed like people who had waited long enough to not want anything rushed, like we both knew what it was like to be touched without being felt. Then 3 soft knocks at the door, not hurried, not uncertain. 3 taps, spaced evenly, like someone already familiar with stepping into places not fully theirs, yet still welcome. I pulled back slightly, breath warm between us. Theo didn't speak. He just looked toward the door, then back at me, his gaze calm, a question without pressure. I didn't hesitate. I gave a small nod. He turned, walked to the door, and opened it. Cold air slipped in, along with the faint scent of pine and smoke. And then the second man stepped inside. He didn't speak right away, didn't scan the room like someone entering a scene. He saw me instantly and stayed looking. "I'm Simon," he said softly. His voice was warm, low even. "Do you want the door to stay open?" I held his gaze, then nodded again. Theo didn't introduce him, didn't explain. He just closed the door behind him, gently, deliberately, and slid the latch down, not to trap anything in, but to protect whatever had just begun. Simon didn't come toward me. He walked slowly toward the armchair across the room, settled in like someone who knew how to hold space without filling it. His arms draped casually across the sides, not relaxed, not tense, just present. Theo stepped forward, took the glass of wine from my hand, set it down with care, then placed his hand lightly on the small of my back. Not to guide,
To ground.
In that moment, I understood something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't alone. Not because there were now 2 men in the room, but because neither of them wanted anything more than what I was already willing to give.
No asking.
No promises. Just the quiet certainty of 2 people, and now a third, who weren't trying to impress, win, or rush. Just stay. The room had grown warmer, but not from the fire. Something quieter had settled in, a calmness I hadn't known I needed. I stood near the edge of the table, wrapped loosely in my robe, not exposed, but not hidden either. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't resisting. I was simply allowing. Simon didn't try to fill the silence. He just sat still, observant, like someone who knew the value of slow arrivals. And then 3 more knocks, Same rhythm, not a request, not an interruption, just a presence letting itself be known. I looked at Theo.
He didn't ask.
He didn't smile. He just looked at me, and this time I didn't nod. I stepped forward and opened the door myself. The man who entered had sharp features, clean, composed, but his eyes held something so unguarded. It felt like warmth spilling out into the room before he even spoke. "Julian," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Not an introduction, more like a truth that didn't need a reaction. He didn't scan the room. He didn't pause. His gaze met mine like he had known exactly where I'd be standing. And I didn't look away. 3 men, 3 energies, not converging, not competing. Caleb, steady. Simon, watchful. Julian, open. I stood in the center, not uncertain, not overwhelmed, but still, not because I needed to be chosen, but because, for the first time, I had allowed myself to be witnessed. They didn't surround me like something to be claimed. They gave space like men who understood that intimacy is not built by moving in, but by allowing someone else to stay exactly where they are, unmasked, unguarded, unedited. Theo stepped behind me, his hand brushing the curve of my neck, fingertips resting at the edge of my robe's loose knot. He didn't tug.
He didn't ask.
He waited. Julian moved to my right. He didn't reach for my hand. He touched the inside of my wrist with the lightest pressure, then brought his lips to the soft space between palm and skin. A gesture that didn't ask, but offered. Simon stood, not to join in, but to tend the fire. He added 2 more logs. The flames rose gently, casting moving shadows of our 4 bodies across the wooden walls. In that flickering glow, I no longer felt like a woman waiting to feel alive. I felt like a woman whose life was already returning to her, one breath at a time. I wasn't being pulled closer. I was being invited, through touch that didn't claim, and through silence that didn't need to be broken. Theo stood behind me, his hand at the nape of my neck, undoing the loose knot of my robe without force.
No pulling.
Just gravity and permission. The fabric slipped down my shoulders, softly, naturally, like something that had waited a long time to be let go of. I didn't flinch. I didn't brace, because in that moment, I didn't feel vulnerable. I felt recognized. Julian stepped in close, but not too close. His gaze steady, his breath calm. His fingertips found my wrist again, tracing it with a kind of reverence that didn't ask for anything in return. When he lifted my hand and pressed a second kiss just beneath the thumb, I didn't feel like something precious. I felt like something real, a living, breathing, responsive being, not for display, but for connection. Simon still hadn't touched me. Instead, he returned to the fire, kneeling to adjust the logs with quiet care. As he moved, the flames rose again, higher now, and their golden light wrapped the room in a warmth that felt deeper than heat. It felt like acceptance. 3 men, 3 tempos.
And me.
Not choosing, not directing, just standing there as if I had finally stepped into the shape of my own body. I wasn't a fantasy to fulfill. I wasn't a role to play. I was the center of something whole. And not because they desired me, but because they made space for me to return to myself. They placed me gently on the long wooden table near the window. Each movement was slow, deliberate, without tension or choreography. 1 man touched my shoulder. Another kissed my inner arm. A third traced the curve of my spine, not to claim me, but to remind me, this is still yours. My eyes fluttered closed, not to escape, but to feel, fully. without performance, without fear. Julian leaned in again, his voice softer than breath. "You don't have to hold anything anymore," he whispered. "You open the door." And I knew he wasn't talking about the one made of wood. They didn't lift me as if I were delicate. They guided me as if I were sovereign, a body not to be handled, but to be honored. The wooden table beneath me wasn't cold. It held a subtle warmth, like it had absorbed years of quiet moments, and was now ready to carry one more. Julian stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my hip, not moving, just holding, like a sentence that didn't need to finish. Theo stood at my head, his palm open against my sternum, grounding, not pressing, a kind of presence that said, "You're here. We know." Simon returned to the space, not with urgency, but with rhythm. He placed a folded wool blanket on the edge of the table, not to cover, but to offer. And then, for the first time, he touched me, only at the ankle. His thumb traced a small circle, and my breath caught in my throat, not from fear, from memory. I had forgotten that touch could be this quiet, this intentional, this safe. There were no commands, no performances, no whispers trying to arouse or control. Only 3 men moving around me, like the air knew how to carry itself. No one rushed. No one reached for more than what was offered. And in that stillness, something unexpected rose in me. Grief. Not for what was happening, but for all the times it hadn't. For the years I had offered my body, like a peace treaty, hoping to be seen, but never fully arrived for. For the nights I had faked safety, just to survive the silence that followed. And now, in this cabin, with snow outside, fire beside me, and nothing being taken, I wept, not loudly, not messily, just the kind of cry that comes when your body finally stops bracing for harm. No one said, "It's okay." No one hushed me. They simply stayed. Julian kissed the tip of my shoulder. Theo ran his hand once down my forearm. Simon kept his fingers resting lightly on my ankle. 3 points of contact. 3 silent agreements. We're here. You're not wrong for needing this. You don't have to perform to be held. When the stillness returned, I wasn't empty. I was full, with breath I didn't have to hold, and with a body that no longer felt like it needed to earn tenderness. I eased myself back into the old armchair near the fire, legs curled beneath me, skin still tingling, not from heat, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being seen and not seized. The robe was back around me, loosely tied. The air was quiet, but not awkward. And then one by one they moved, not away, not out the door, just into the space with me, without expectation, without the need to define what had just happened. Theo was the first to move to the kitchen. He poured hot cocoa from a matte black thermos and set it beside me without a word. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. The steam rising from the cup said more than language ever could. "You're being kept." Julian brought over a warm towel. The scent of peppermint and cedar rose from it gently. He knelt, one knee to the wooden floor, and wiped my feet, slowly, reverently, then pressed the towel lightly against the nape of my neck. I didn't realize I had tears until the corners of my eyes felt warm. Not because anyone hurt me, but because no one did. Simon didn't touch me. He sat at the edge of the bed, hands resting behind him, gaze tilted toward the window. Outside, snow blanketed the porch railing, soft and undisturbed. He spoke, voice low. "This view, it's not for phones. It's for people who know how to really look." I smiled. And something in me, something quiet and long buried, smiled back. No one made promises. No one said, "Let's do this again." They simply stayed. Theo draped a wool blanket across my shoulders, his touch as light as breath. No urgency, no claiming. Julian adjusted a book on the shelf. Simon placed a kettle back on the stove. They each found small tasks, small movements, not because they were trying to distract, but because sometimes the most intimate act is letting someone sit in silence while their body softens
from all the years it was made to harden.
At some point, the cocoa cooled. The fire dimmed to low embers, but I didn't feel the cold. My body, once always on alert, was now quiet, not numb, just no longer preparing to defend itself. Julian returned, this time with a pair of thick wool socks in his hand, soft gray, worn just enough to feel like they'd been waiting. He knelt again, lifted one foot gently, and slid the sock on slowly, not like he was dressing me, but like he was thanking my body for not fleeing. Then the other, still in silence, still with reverence. Simon brevettea. Theo adjusted the fire. No one said, "Are you okay?" Because they didn't need to. What they did say came in gestures. The second log on the fire, the pot of hot water left to steep. The chair moved slightly closer to mine, so I wouldn't feel the space too wide. Julian stood beside the bookshelf, thumb tracing the worn spine of a small, linen-bound volume. He looked at me, not seeking permission, but offering pause. "Would it be all right if I read to you?" I nodded, because something in me already knew the answer was yes. He opened the book with care
and began.
His voice was steady, quiet. No performance, no inflection. Just words, spoken where they were meant to land. "I don't want you to open the door for me. I want you to leave the key with someone who doesn't feel the need to break it." I closed my eyes, not to sleep,
to breathe.
Evenly. Finally, outside, the snow deepened. Inside, nothing was hurried. Simon added firewood. Theo steeped a second pot of tea. Julian sat beside me, the book now resting in his lap. No one filled the space. No one needed to. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to fill it either. I woke up before the light fully changed. The room was still tinted in blue-gray shadows, and the snow outside hadn't yet melted from the corners of the window panes. The fire had burned down to its core, but the warmth, it remained.
Somehow,
the blanket was still wrapped around my shoulders. Theo's shirt slipped over my frame sometime during the night, draped softly across my thighs. I didn't sit up right away. I didn't check my phone. I didn't try to replay what had happened. Instead, I stayed very still and listened. Footsteps.
Slow.
Familiar. Moving across the floor with care, like someone trying not to disturb what didn't need fixing. Then the sound of the kettle. A drawer opening. A cabinet closing with a muted thud. And then a pause. Just outside the bedroom door. "You awake?" His voice didn't break the moment. It fit into it. Soft, low. The warmth of early sunlight in sound. I sat up, not with hesitation, but ease. My hair still messy, my limbs a little sore, but none of it asked for fixing. I opened the door barefoot. Theo was standing there, 2 mugs of ginger tea in hand. He offered one without staring, without searching, just steady eyes. The kind that had seen both strength and softness in me, and chose not to label either. We stepped out onto the front porch. Snow dusted the railing in powdery silence. The trees stood like they had all along. The world hadn't shifted, but I had. And somehow the quiet knew it. like it was holding space for a version of me that finally felt like it belonged. We didn't talk about the night.
There was no need to.
Everything that needed to be said had already been said in breath and stillness and intention. After a while, I turned to Theo. Usually after something like this, what do people say? He gave a quiet laugh, then shrugged. They ask for your number. Or say, let's do this again sometime. I sipped my tea. So, we're not doing this again? My voice wasn't uncertain. It was just honest. He tilted his head, thinking. Then, if something needs to be repeated just so it won't be forgotten, maybe it wasn't real enough to begin with. But if it reached you, truly, then you won't need to hold on to it as proof. It'll live inside you. I nodded, not because I understood everything, but because I knew what it meant. There are some moments you don't carry forward to relive. You carry them because they changed the shape of your silence. By late afternoon, I was back in the city. Same skyline, same traffic, same people walking briskly past coffee shops with earbuds in, all headed somewhere but barely present in it. Denver hadn't changed, but something in me had. Not in a way anyone would notice. Not dramatic, not glowing, just realigned. Like someone had quietly returned the missing piece of a puzzle I didn't know I'd stopped searching for. I unlocked the door to my apartment. The hallway light flickered like it always did. The air still smelled like worn wood and distant takeout. I dropped my duffel on the floor, took off my coat, didn't reach for my laptop, didn't check the notifications piling up. Instead, I poured a glass of water, sat down by the window, and looked at the exact same view I'd looked at every day for the past 3 years. Except this time, I was in it, present,
Steady. Whole.
my computer screen still had the draft of that brand proposal open, the one about confidence and wellness, a campaign I could write in my sleep. Clean lines, polished message, on trend. But now it felt hollow. I opened a new document, typed slowly, without pressure. For years, I made myself smaller, palatable, professional. I silenced my longing, convinced it had to be deserved first. But I was wrong. A woman doesn't need permission to feel. She doesn't need to explain why she's tired of being touched without being understood. She only needs space, safe enough to stop apologizing for being human. I read it back once, then again, and again. Each time, it landed deeper. Each time, it asked me gently, "Are you ready to stop performing?" The version of me who left for that cabin had been quiet, careful, practiced. The version who returned was no louder, but far less willing to remain invisible. Days passed. Emails were answered. Deadlines returned. Groceries were bought. And the city, indifferent as ever, moved on with its pace. I didn't tell anyone what happened in that cabin, not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't need to make it fit into language meant for things you can explain. I didn't text Theo, didn't wonder if Julian would reach out, didn't ask myself whether Simon thought of me. That wasn't the point. That had never been the point. I wasn't aching to go back. I wasn't chasing what we shared, because what happened wasn't meant to be repeated. It was meant to be remembered, not as a fantasy, but as a mirror I had finally looked into without turning away. I started moving differently, not dramatically, but with a softness I hadn't worn in years. I stopped saying sorry before sharing how I felt. I began noticing how often I used the word fine when I wasn't. I stopped asking myself if I was too much every time I needed to be held, or not enough when all I craved was stillness. One morning, I returned to the document I had written the day I came home. This time, I didn't edit. I didn't refine the message. I just read it aloud to myself, like a quiet vow. Real confidence doesn't arrive in the mirror. It begins in the moment you stop shaping yourself around who might misunderstand you. You are not too much. You were never not enough. You are simply here. I don't know if I'll see them again. I don't need to, because what stayed with me wasn't their hands. It was their silence, their listening, the way they asked nothing of me and gave me back everything I hadn't known I'd lost. And if you're still here, reading these words, feeling something that lives quietly beneath your own skin, maybe this story wasn't just mine. Maybe it's your reminder too, that you don't need permission, that you don't need a crisis to pause, that it's not too late to come back to yourself. And maybe, just maybe, you don't need to close the door all the way next time either. Just leave it open a little. Enough for light, enough for breath, enough for you.